So I know out of this group, someone, probably more than us than we would like to admit, has encountered something in a church service that they didn't like. It defied their expectations. I think we all have. I can remember, my upbringing was in the Churches of Christ, and if you know the Churches of Christ, they don't do instrumental music at all. And I was preaching one day, and I was preaching about the body of Christ and how we work together. And I decided to give them a little bit of a twist, and because I was using the context of an orchestra and how an orchestra has to play together in order to make good music. And so I brought my sermon notes in a guitar case. And I thought we might have to have ER or the emergency room or ambulance come because of heart attacks. But we all have experienced stuff in a worship service that we don't like or that doesn't meet our expectations, right? What are some, and I know a lot of you have seen a lot of changes in worship service. So if you think back 50 years ago, what was a worship service like?
50 years ago?
Well,
We sang in Luke's, and we had communion with
50 years.
12 deacons.
12 deacons, okay.
Who did it
Okay.
down the school.
Sure.
Men wore suits, and the ladies wore hats and gloves.
Hats and gloves. Men wore hats and gloves? No. Sorry. I kept hearing some things over here too. So.
The men wore suits and white shirts and ties.
Oh, the men, yes, dressed up.
Yes.
The question was, in your experience, what was church like in your early experience? And I threw out 50 years ago, but just early experience. Now, Myrna, did you have a piano in that church?
Yes.
You did, but you didn't have an orchestra, or okay?
We didn't have an organ back in this building. I can remember way back. Church was very formal.
Formal.
Considered formal. Everybody dressed up.
Yes.
The choir paraded in their robes.
Ah, so you had a choir in your congregation, okay?
Adult choir, and right across was the children's choir, so the adults during the service could stare at us. We were talking, but I was never talking.
Right.
And of course, they put the children right behind the minister.
Oh, yeah.
That's the way it was set up. And it was just very, and then when communion came, we had, I think it was about 8 or 10, and they would come march up, and it used to be, first it was mainly just men, then the ladies.
Okay.
And it was almost like a ceremony. They'd go up front, and the minister would say this whole thing, and they would have their communion, and the
Yes.
deacons would have theirs, and then they would bring it all out.
Very ritualistic.
And they would bring it back up.
Yes.
Very
And you knew what to expect. Every time you went, it always happened pretty much the same way.
As soon as that was over, we sang the doxology.
Yep. Okay.
And it's still that way to this day.
Okay.
Except the church closed down about a year ago because nobody.
Attendance. Yeah, that happens. Change.
They didn't change.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and that is a very good thought. They didn't change, and thus they died. I kind of want to bring that up a little bit later.
It was really hot in the church because we didn't have any large older building, but no air conditioning.
No air conditioning.
And so at the evening service, in the summertime, we always had it out on the lawn.
Yeah. Ah, that's cool. Yeah. And oftentimes you would see those fans. They usually had some printed on it or something. They'd be in the.
Mortuary across the street.
Yeah.
Church, and they provided, I guess, all the fans.
Right. Well, let me ask, what was your feeling the first day you ever heard an electric guitar on stage? Didn't belong in church?
I was young, so it was cool.
It was cool? Yeah, you were young? You're like, rock on. All right, okay.
I have to understand I was raised Baptist.
Yes, I mean, I can tell you even to this day, having instrumental music, it doesn't theologically bother me, but it's still a little unusual to me because of my upbringing in the Churches of Christ, where we didn't have that. So it's still a little unusual to me Theologically, I have nothing wrong.
Band, it might not be unusual.
And maybe not. I think I would really like, well, and I don't know, an orchestra might get old too, or weird. Choir, I'm not sure how I would deal with a choir.
And if you, art music is tame compared to
Life Church is pretty vivacious.
I was just going to say, I was in the first band.
Mm-hmm.
They allowed at Cookson Hills. Y'all remember the choir from Cookson that would travel in the summer?
Ah,
Well,
okay.
I was in that, but,
Wow.
then we got to, after our first CIY conference, as kids decided we needed a band, so we made a band. So we had drums and we had a
Oh my. So you were right in there with Cindy. Yeah, let's do this. Okay.
see it at church. We did our
Okay.
whole special, but it wasn't
So-
the whole thing.
I want you to hang on just for a little bit to that insight of your feelings. How did you feel at that moment when something was different about your church experience and you didn't like it? It was like, ooh, that's not right. Okay? Because we're going to talk about some instances today where that happened to the Jews. And it wasn't even Hellenistic influence. We've been talking about all this outside influence, but we're going to get to a point where Jews do some things or believe some things that other Jews do or don't believe, and they rock each other's world. And it's not a good thing. So when we talk about Christians in church who do things that don't necessarily meet my expectation or your expectation, and you want to do things that don't really meet their expectation, how does that work? How do we live together in relationship with God? So I just want to kind of hang on to that feeling and that thought. And when we get to that point, think through that. How would you feel if you were in their position with the experience that you already have? So, little bit of review. Last week we talked about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He named himself Epiphanes. Antiochus IV was the Seleucid leader in Syria, that empire that was part of the Greek Empire. He did some bad things. Do you remember what he did? We talked about it last week. What did he do last week? Well, it wasn't last week that he did it, but that'd be weird. He defiled the temple. That was prime. How did he do that? Slaughtered a pig on the altar. That was wrong in so many ways. And not only did he defile the temple, but what did he do to the Jewish religion that existed? He tried to wipe it out, right? Get rid of the laws. Get rid of the books of the law. You can't do circumcision. You can't sacrifice to Yahweh. He said, turn it off. Do things the Hellenistic way. Bad guy. Now, there was a group of people that we called the Hasidim, pious ones, that didn't like what was going on, and all they needed was a trigger. All they needed was a leader. And that leader came in an elderly priest named Mattathias from the little town of Modin. And I did find out where Modin is. If you take Jerusalem, and if you know where Tel Aviv is today, Tel Aviv is just about midway on the Mediterranean coast, north and south. And between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv is a little town called Modin. So it's just a smidgen north of Jerusalem and a bit west. That's where Modin was, and that's where Mattathias was from. And when the emissary from Syria came to force sacrifice to a foreign god, they asked Mattathias, who was the priest, to be a good representative and be the first to sacrifice. And he refused, right? But some other timid Jew did offer sacrifice, or at least proceeded to offer sacrifice, and Mattathias did what? Killed him. Killed the Jew and killed the Syrian emissary, the person who was representing Antiochus. And then he and his boys ran for the hills. Now, that was the trigger that started a mass revolt. This revolt was more in the form of guerrilla warfare, and people who didn't like what was going on, came to Mattathias' group, and they built an army. It was a guerrilla warfare army. It wasn't an open field army. Mattathias died. He was an older fella, and he left the reins to his son Judah. Judah had a nickname, and that was Maccabee. Maccabee means the hammer. Now, Maccabee is where we get the name of this revolt. The revolt we know of today as the Maccabean Revolt. And we have, remember those 4 books in our apocryphal literature, those extra books in the Old Testament? There's Maccabee, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees. 2 of them are recognized in the Old Testament, in some Old Testament Bibles. Catholic Bible still recognizes those 2. 1st and 2nd Maccabees. They were written later, but they give us the history and the story of these revolts. So Judah is successful in his guerrilla warfare, and they recapture Jerusalem. When they recapture Jerusalem, they do what to the temple? They defeat Syria, and they cleanse the temple. They take out the foreign idols, the altar that Antiochus set up, and they reinstitute the sacrificial worship of the Jews. This cleansing of the temple, you remember when that happened? It was the 25th of the month Kislev. Now, Kislev is a Jewish month, but it generally occurs November, December, depending on the moon phases. So somewhere in November, December is the month of Kislev, and it happened on the 25th. Do you know the Jewish holiday known as Hanukkah? Around Christmas. Hanukkah is the celebration of the cleansing of the temple. That right there. They celebrate the cleansing of the temple in the Hanukkah, the celebration of Hanukkah. And it happens right around Christmas, because this happened on the 25th of, in our world we'd say December, but it's the 25th of Kislev. Now, they don't retain control of Jerusalem. It goes back and forth. Syria conquers it again. It goes back and forth. There's some bad stuff that happened. We covered that last week. Feel free to go back and watch the video if you want to get a little more detail there. We're just recapping. But over time, Jonathan and Simon, Judah dies in battle, and his brothers, still Mattathias' sons, Jonathan and Simon, gain control. Now, they gain control more politically than militarily. They understand the dynamics of policy and politics, and at the time when they are steering the ship, Syria is having their own problems. And so they gain control of the area. Simon is set up as the high priest. Now, remember, way back when, actually it was about this time and a little bit before, Onias was the legitimate high priest, but Onias went to solve a problem, and while he was out of town, his brother paid money to become the high priest, and then someone else paid even more money to become the high priest, and so now we had a free-for-all on the high priest role, the office of high priest. Well, when Simon comes in, he is now the high priest. What do the Jews do? He's not legitimately a descendant of Aaron. He's a Levite, but he's not a descendant of Aaron. And you have to be a descendant of Aaron to be a high priest. Well, what they do is they say, well, Onias defected. He was out of town. When he came back in town, he left for Egypt, and we no longer have a legitimate high priest because he chose to leave. Therefore, we will set up a new dynasty, in essence, of high priesthood. And Simon will be the leader of that, the head of that new lineage of high priests. And they lose it, they gain it, they lose it, they gain it. But over time, when Simon dies, his son, John Hyrcanus, and we talked about him just briefly last week, he takes control of Judea. John Hyrcanus, both politically and militarily, really solidifies what we can refer to as a Judean independence. Now, we have, since the time of the Babylonian captivity, we have been vassals of bigger states. You know, you were conquered by Babylon. You were, and even before that, Assyria, if you were talking the northern kingdom. You were conquered by Persia. You were conquered by Greece. We are now at a point where we are independent once again. There are some politics in there, and in fact, he lost independence for a while, but then again, Syria had their own issues, their own problems, and during their problems, John reestablished that independence. And that's where I really want to pick up today and start. John was what we refer to as the first of the Hasmoneans. Hasmonean is the family name or the family group of this Mattathias fella, way back here. Mattathias the Hasmonean, and his lineage becomes what we know as the Hasmonean dynasty. And these are legitimate, independent kings of Judea between the time of the Grecian Empire and the Roman Empire. And that's something we don't hear about very much, that there was a period of about 60 to 80 years of independence. Now, that independence was gained because Syria lost control, and they actually had a lot of other little nations break off and become independent as well. So there were a lot of a return to smaller independent nations at this period in time. It was really a time between strong Grecian control and strong Roman control. There was a little bit of time when there was really no large control that was effective. And that's where we are. And John took advantage of that. John was serving as high priest. Now, John never took the title of king. You mentioned last week we didn't have this title of king during this time. He never took that title, but he acted as a ruler. But one other thing that he did is he established, or we believe he established, what was called the Assembly of the Jews. Now, if you remember back when we talked about Ezra and the Sanhedrin, and how the Sanhedrin was one of those bodies that kind of worked somewhat as a civil court or a supreme court, if you will. We think that John Hyrcanus established this Assembly of the Jews in much the same way. He was in control. He more or less had ultimate control of the nation, but it seems like, anyway, his primary focus was the priesthood and military expansion. He spent a lot of time doing that. But his personal role was around the priesthood. And so it seems that he let this assembly be civil leaders in a lot of ways. Now, who is going to be a part of that assembly? Very likely it's bringing back what we talked about as the Sanhedrin and those representatives of the aristocracy or the political leaders of the time. You might have had some religious leaders also as a part of that. Probably it's less Pharisees, although we do see, and we'll talk about Pharisees becoming part of this group. But we had some religious groups and we had some civil groups that were kind of going on at the time. A lot of the civil groups were Hellenistic people, the Greek people, and they were wealthy people. Remember, the commerce was really big at that time. And so Jerusalem was the epicenter of Judean world, and that's where they would live. And so it's very likely that that's who comprised this group. We don't really know exactly who was a part of it. But John Hyrcanus did quite a number of things. He forced the recognition of, we'll skip that part. Took control of the land. At his time, and I said this last week, and I really was wrong. what I said was during his reign, he expanded Judea to the size of David's kingdom. He started that process. By the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, the Judean kingdom, the Israel, was as big or possibly even bigger than the kingdom at the time of David. Okay. So he started that process. One of the things that he did that a lot of people did not like is he used foreigners in his army. In one of his battles, they tried to lay siege to Jerusalem, and he made people pretty mad because he forced any non-military people out of town in order to maintain the siege, because you only have limited food and water and whatnot during a siege. Well, the problem is all of these common people who were forced out of town were stuck between a rock and a hard place. They were kicked out of Jerusalem, but now we have the Assyrian army here, and they're caught in the middle. So what happens is Hyrcanus pulls them all back into the city, and okay, but now he's really made some people mad. And so he has to kind of get back in favor with a lot of people. But there's some things that he does that really kind of makes him out of favor. One of those is because his military wasn't as strong as he wanted it to be, he hired foreigners to be part of his military. And again, the people are like, okay, you put us out to pasture, literally. You're hiring foreigners to be your military leaders. You're doing some things that we don't really like. We like your ideas of expansion, but we don't like how you're going about doing it. So he had some problems, internal problems. However, he reigned for quite a while, and by the end of it, he turned all that around. People actually did support him in the end. One of the big things he did as he expanded the kingdom is this was central to gaining support, both religiously and politically. He conquered Samaria. Yes, conquered Samaria. Remember, Samaria had kind of grown into its own way back when, and you remember when when the Israelites returned from Babylonian captivity and they started rebuilding the temple, and the folks in Samaria said, "Hey, let us help." And they said, the people who came back said, "No, we don't recognize you as true Jews." Well, what did they do? The folks in Samaria went and built their own temple. Where did they build that temple? That temple was built on a place called Mount Gerizim. Now, Mount Gerizim is actually a very important place in the Bible and in the Old Testament history. Have you heard of a little town called Shechem? A lot of stuff happens in Shechem in the Old Testament. But let's go all the way back, and we're going to start in... let's go back to Genesis 33, and you don't have to turn there if you don't want. I'll just hit some highlights here. I find this kind of fascinating. But in Genesis 33, this is back when Jacob is returning from his uncle, and he meets up with Esau, and then he goes his way. And when he goes his way, he goes in verse 8.